This is Mob Vlog, a YouTube podcast launched in January 2020 and hosted by Adam Flowers, a former street magician who once tried out for America's Got Talent, and Frank Collada, a former Mafia enforcer. Collada was a henchman and childhood friend of Tony Spilotro, a member of the Mafia in Chicago sent to Vegas to protect their business in the city. In the 1995 film Casino, which dramatized the collapse of their criminal enterprise in Vegas, Collada was represented by the supporting character Frank Marino, played by Frank Vincent. Unlike the fictional Marino, however, Frank Collada turned state's evidence and became a government witness years before Spilotro was murdered as a liability to his organization. 28 years later, he uploaded a video to YouTube briefly summarizing his criminal history, including committing 2 murders and being involved in 2 more. He invited viewers to ask him about his life of crime and promised to tell his life story in upcoming videos. 7 months of uploads later, the channel, then known as Coffee with Collada, was pushing 20,000 subscribers and getting some sidelong glances. Comedian Mike Gibbons, on the August 16th episode of his shared podcast, Sunday Papers, was incredulous when he read a CNN article talking about Collada turning his crimes into shtick. And his co-host Greg Fitzsimmons joked about the old mobster talking himself into a prison sentence and quipped,
"Oh God, I hope that guy dies of COVID."
In fact, before the month was out, Frank Collada, who had already been infected by the time that article was published, did indeed die of COVID-19. Adam Flowers was revolted. He'd worked with Collada for years in his last job as a tour guide and considered him a friend, even if this only came about because of Collada's criminal past. Gibbons and Fitzsimmons, at the risk of hypocrisy on their part, considered the Coffee with Collada venture to be in poor taste. But perhaps they shouldn't have been too surprised. Mobsters have been telling their stories for decades, and a YouTube channel was the logical conclusion. Coffee with Collada isn't even the only channel where you can hear tales of the Mafia right from the source. In short, the Mafia is a criminal enterprise with the trappings of a secret society. Its members don't even call it the Mafia. Within its ranks, it is known by the euphemistic name Cosa Nostra, an Italian phrase usually translated as our thing. Full members of this organization, referred to as made men, are given a very formal induction ceremony where they swear they will burn in hell if they reveal the organization's secrets. The overarching gangs are described as crime families, though membership is generally not hereditary. Former Philadelphia Inquirer crime correspondent George Anastasia summed up the ideal business model for the Mafia in 4 words: make money, not headlines. This was a lesson the Mafia had to learn the hard way. Al Capone, the Chicago bootlegger and a forefather of the modern Mafia in America, once held a press conference where he justified breaking the law on the grounds that no one obeyed prohibition and all I've ever done is supply a public demand. With the public apathetic on enforcement of America's short-lived ban on alcoholic drinks and secrecy and intimidation stymieing prosecution for gangland murders, federal prosecutors took to charging and convicting Capone's underlings of tax evasion to get them off the street. When Capone himself was finally convicted in 1931, he was hit with an 11-year sentence, and by the time he got out, he'd gone mad from long, undiagnosed neurosyphilis. Attention would turn to Charles Lucky Luciano of New York City. By the end of the 1920s, displaced members of the original Sicilian Mafia and Americanized Italian gangsters had formed the basis of what would be the city's 5 families. And in 1928, the boss of the largest of these gangs, Joe Mazzaria, triggered a war when he tried to extract a $10,000 tribute from other New York crime bosses. The opposition centered on Salvatore Maranzano, the leader of a clan of gangsters from Castellammare de Golfo who went to war with battle cries of saving the Castellammare's freedom and honor. which his lieutenant Joseph Bonanno would parrot decades later. Luciano was one of Massaria's men, but 3 years into this war, he got fed up with the cramp it put in his business and cut a deal with Maranzano to betray his boss. Luciano arranged for Massaria's murder, successfully executed April 15, 1931, and took over his gang, while Maranzano took a victory lap, held a secret conference where the 5 families were officially formed, and tried to set himself up as a boss of bosses. This lasted until September 10th. Luciano had been tipped off that Maranzano was going to have him killed as a threat to his power, so he sent his own gunmen to eliminate his would-be boss. Luciano had the sense to not try to claim the boss of bosses title himself, instead declaring that all the mafia bosses in the United States would be equals and mediate their disputes in their own corporate-inspired board of directors known as the Commission. It was this innovation that meant Luciano, not Maranzano, would be considered the founder of the modern American Mafia. Outside of the organization, little of this was understood at the time. What prosecutors did know was he was a major figure in organized crime who lived large and had tried to curry favor with presidential candidates at the 1932 Democratic Convention. Not as outlandish as Capone, but still a target. At the time, prosecuting a crime boss wasn't easy. U.S. law targeted the people who ran rackets, but there wasn't a way to go after the overall boss of an organization if he didn't commit a crime personally. Special prosecutor Thomas Dewey did it anyway. Finding enough witnesses who would testify Luciano personally took part in a prostitution ring to put him on trial in 1936. He was convicted, perhaps railroaded under the letter of the law, and received a minimum 30-year sentence. This was commuted to deportation after World War II in exchange for ordering mafia-controlled longshoremen unions to cooperate with U.S. naval intelligence in spy hunting. An example was set, but the lesson didn't always stick. In 1970, Joseph Colombo, namesake boss of his New York crime family, decided the best way to respond to FBI scrutiny was to create a political activist group, the Italian-American Civil Rights League, who would picket the FBI and hold 2 massive rallies in protest of their people being smeared with the fiction of the mafia. During the second of these rallies, he was shot and put in a coma by a wannabe gangster who was almost certainly a patsy for one of Colombo's enemies in the mafia. In 1986, after taking over the larger Gambino crime family the previous December by assassinating his old boss, John Gotti started building a rapport with the press that set him on the path to become the most famous mob boss of his day. This behavior is usually cited as the cause of his own downfall, egging on law enforcement to take him down, but by the time he took power, he already had 2 indictments against him. There's no disputing Gotti's behavior was ruinous to the Gambinos, however. His decision to feed his ego by making the family's captains, or capos, meet with him once a week at his Manhattan social club, the Ravenite, made it easy for FBI surveillance to fill in the gaps in their knowledge of the family's structure. This rule, however, is turned on its head if one, for whatever reason, ends their criminal career by testifying against their former colleagues in the mafia. The Federal Witness Protection Program can keep the ex-mobsters safe from retaliation, and the government gives participants some money to start a new life, but what to do after that? In the 2015 trial of Bonanno family mobster Vincent Osorio, the 68-year-old former underboss Salvatore Vitale would complain on the witness stand that it was impossible for him to pass a background check for a job, even with his new identity. For many of these people, if they want to go legit, their best asset is the story of their old life. They need to let the world know who they are. And there are people who want to hear these stories. In all mafia families, made men, those who are part of Cosa Nostra, are always outnumbered by associates, those who work with Cosa Nostra. To be chosen for induction is considered an honor only given to Italian-American associates who have proven themselves as exceptionally reliable and loyal. It wasn't until 1962 that a member of this self-styled elite found himself in a position with no way out but to give up the secrets he'd sworn to keep. Joseph Valachi had been inducted by Maranzano during the Castellamarizi War, but the shakeups that followed victory left him in Luciano's family. In 1962, he found himself doing time in USP Atlanta for heroin trafficking with the family's newest boss, Vito Genovese. And Valachi believed, Genovese believed, that he had been giving up information to the feds. By his account, Genovese put Valachi on guard by making some passive-aggressive accusation to his face and giving him a literal kiss of death. Understandably paranoid, Valachi then got himself into a bigger jam when he mistook a fellow inmate for one of Genovese's men out to get him and beat him to death. Valachi had been trying to reach out to the Fed's Bureau of Narcotics, but only after Genovese made his intentions clear, and no one took him up on his offer until after he got himself a capital murder charge. He pleaded out for a sentence of life in prison and was put into protective custody for debriefing, first by the Bureau of Narcotics, then with the FBI. A year later, Valachi and the feds were ready to tell America exactly what they were up against. Back in 1950, Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver took it upon himself to get to the bottom of organized illegal gambling in America, dimly understood to be controlled by what was popularly known at the time as the National Crime Syndicate. He got the go-ahead to form a special committee to investigate organized crime, and the following year he took to live TV to broadcast the questioning of gangsters subpoenaed. It made Kefauver's career and took Genovese's predecessor, Frank Costello, uncomfortably into the limelight, but most of those questioned safely hid behind their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. A decade later, things were different. Valachi was sent to the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations for his own televised hearings. He was the presenter for the FBI's first real expose on the Mafia, combining their own information gleaned from investigations and wiretaps with his own inside knowledge. Valachi gave America the real name of the mythical syndicate Cosa Nostra. He told them where they operated, explained their structure, and how they came to be. Today, Valachi's testimony is considered a turning point in the history of the Mafia, even if major prosecutions were still years off. At the time, however, reactions were more skeptical. The uneducated Valachi didn't come off as a particularly credible witness, and his FBI handlers tasked him with discussing the Mafia outside New York, something he had very little first-hand knowledge of. Valachi's 15 minutes of fame seemed over, but as far as he was concerned, there was still work to do. By the time he reached the Senate committee, he seemed to have found a new purpose, taking revenge on his old colleagues by exposing the secret society. While the imprisoned Genovese offered a $100,000 bounty on Valachi and then hoped for the best, Valachi was proactive in his protective solitary confinement. With the Justice Department's encouragement, he began work on his memoirs, eventually putting down 1,180 very messy pages. The task of cleaning up for a future publication fell on one Peter Maas, the journalist who first broke the story of his cooperation. That future was put into doubt, however, in 1966. Without collaboration of Valachi's claims, there were still those who could argue that the Mafia did not exist. Mario Cuomo, former governor of New York, held this view as late as 1985, when he complained the term was overused, with the end goal of linking Italian Americans as a whole to organized crime in the nation. Marginalization and discrimination against Italian immigrants back at the turn of the century gave some credibility to this perception of a slight, which Joe Colombo would soon be taking advantage of. Valachi's revenge, Italian-American activists said, was going to hurt their community and applied enough political pressure to get the Justice Department to reverse course and file an unprecedented injunction to block publication of the book. Faced with a judge who made clear he considered the case to be an overreach, the Justice Department offered Maas a compromise. Their official stance had been that a book by Valachi would be injurious to law enforcement. But if Maas wanted to write a book about Valachi, ostensibly on his own, sourced from interviews he held with the man, he could. Officially, Valachi's manuscript was off limits, but Maas got around this by having Valachi retell the details he needed during their interviews. In a 1997 TV interview of his own, Maas recalled that 24 publishers rejected his completed book titled The Valachi Papers. This time the problem wasn't outrage, but apathy. Publishers didn't think people were interested in the Mafia. The Valachi Papers officially was published in 1968, but it didn't actually reach stores until January 1969. Maas was dubiously told the publisher, Putnam, wasn't skipping the Christmas season to bury the book, but that the assumption was people would be returning unwanted gifts to exchange for Maas' work. In any case, as Maas recalled, the first printing sold out in 3 days. Even if Valachi's story wasn't entirely accepted, the public's interest in gangsters and the mob, kindled by Congress Live TV exposés, was strong. In a 1990 editorial, Maas described the Mafia as finding a place in American culture as national mythology, likening it to the legend of King Arthur in England, and framing it as a replacement to stories of the Wild West. Of course, in that article, he wasn't just talking about his own book. 1969 also saw Putnam publish Mario Puzo's The Godfather, a novel of the idealized Corleone family, both a crime family and a blood family, taking on the rest of the New York mob over their refusal to get into the drug trade. Maas' goal in writing the Valachi Papers was to be the first to tell the story of the American Mafia, and, as a source, his book has mostly held up over time. There is one major flaw in Valachi's history that slipped into the final product, however. In the aftermath of Maranzano's murder, there were rumors of a nationwide purge of his supporters, with 40 mafioso supposedly being killed the same day as the old boss of bosses. Valachi believed the rumors of the purge, nicknamed the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, and repeated them to Congress and Maas. The American Sicilian Vespers briefly entered into the historical record until a 1976 study confirmed only 4 potentially unrelated murders took place that day. As for Valachi, during the 1966 controversy, he was moved from the Washington, D.C. jail he'd been in since his Senate appearance to the FCI Island in Michigan. Between the loss of the special accommodations he'd enjoyed in D.C. and the stress of the U.S. government seemingly turning against him, he attempted suicide. And Peter Maas was brought in for one final visit to try to cheer him up. His life would ultimately end in a converted 2-cell suite with his own kitchen, similar to the previous arrangement in D.C. in FCI La Tuna, Texas. By the time of his death in 1971, he'd outlived Vito Genovese and gotten some revenge against the Mafia, with successful testimony against Joe Colombo's successor, Carmine Persico. But he also earned another reward. $30,000 of royalties from the Valachi Papers were sent his way, half of it paying off back taxes. His original manuscript, The Real Thing, is in the care of the National Archives at the JFK Library.